Testing. Testing.
Welcome back. I am always excited to see all of you here at this wonderful event because it not only shows me the value of the historical presentations that are made to you, including all of them that are on the list today, but it also makes me realize how deep the historical roots are in our city, how much it matters to all of you, and how much your being here today kind of validates the wonderful efforts of the professionals here at the library and at the Public Museum and at the City Archive, all of which are indescribable assets here in our city, and all of which, as I hope all of you know, are open for you to look at and paw through and increase your personal knowledge of the neighborhoods that you live in and the city that you call home. So, I'm glad you're here. I have the privilege and the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. I've known Ruth Van Stee for many years. She tells me that she had been working prior to her recent retirement, had been working in the area of the fourth floor, the archive and local history section here at the library, for only 15 years. I would have guessed it was more like 100 years. But of course, that would have meant that she would have had started when she was like 1 year old or less, right? Anyway, Ruth has been and remains a priceless asset to the historical community here in Grand Rapids. I don't think I've ever known anyone who works in the field and has worked at the library who has been more open, more generous, and more helpful in the searches that all of us, in one way or another, undertake through the system here at the library. I myself have been pulled back from going the wrong way a couple of times and set on the proper path more than a few times by Ruth when she said, well, just a minute, and goes through those magic doors into the archive and emerges with a box of something that not only I had never seen before, but I never dreamed existed. Those skills, that tenacity, that dedication are evident in her talk today. She has gathered together information that would otherwise be spattered all over the collection and probably beyond the reach of most of us. She's pulled it together to give us an insight about the early days here in Grand Rapids and a select group of its inhabitants. Listen carefully. You'll learn things that you simply didn't know existed before. That's the kind of trademark of Ruth Van Stee's work. With that, I was promised 45 seconds when I came up here. And many of you know that 45 seconds and Tom Dilley's name hardly ever appear in the same sentence. Well, this is one of those days. I'm going to get out of the way so the real fun can begin. Thank you.
Okay. I knew it was going to be 45 seconds. I was going to beg for more time here. And I probably would have changed the name from Local Early African Americans after I was starting to devise this talk to frame it toward, trying to make sure it doesn't ring, to frame it emphasizing a different direction for history detectives, for the detective part of it. And I'm going to emphasize names, but I probably should have had something like that in the title. This is one where we were stuck with. I'll be talking about names. Matthew begins his gospel with the lineage of Jesus all the way back. You know, and even women in his mind. Readers, I got so for my and Mrs. Ford is taken ill, and another one's child is gravely ill. Or, like the example of visiting, Anthony Buckner is visiting from Battle Creek, is visiting his sister, Mrs. Craig, in Grand Rapids. Aha! So now I know Mrs. Craig's maiden name because her brother's name is Buckner. So all these little tidbits can give you a rounded out picture of a certain person and the community here. But then, as I was reading through all these columns in the Plain Dealer, I realized all these people in Michigan and the African American communities, they all knew each other. If they didn't know them personally, they all knew them by name at least. And then when you think about it, they got together regularly for statewide fraternal meetings, like the Grand Masons and the Elks, sometimes meeting in Grand Rapids, the State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and then there were once a year, and then there were annual Emancipation Day proclamations, celebrations, and they regularly got together for that. And there were railroads would advertise a reduced tickets to the Emancipation Day place down in Battle Creek, and they could take advantage of the reduced price to hop on the train to attend. So they would meet people from around the state, and a lot of them were related to people around the state as well. The last one is the archival, the collections that are upstairs. James Craig is one, an older one, and William Glenn we've had for a long time. He was an activist in the 60s and 70s. We have the study club records, and that's a wonderful resource, especially of names of women in the community. There's a Kent County African American baseball team collection, Paul Collins catalog, Helen Claytor's civil rights. We have just recently, we acquired more, well, not too recently, Dr. Browning, who was a doctor here, came here in 1906. His daughter sent us, or granddaughter sent us some old pictures and so on. And we just received a couple of years ago the New Hope church record. Also, when I was going through the archival collections years ago, we collected with Grace. It was Chris Byron's fantastic idea. When you find a picture, let's make a copy of it, and we'll put them all in a binder. And there's 2 binders upstairs you might want to look through if you want to look through old pictures of African Americans, and they're from all over the archives. But we've designated the place where they're kept. So I thought at first that I may be, as I tell you some of these stories, I may be sugarcoating the lives of this early 1%. But Randall Jelks, in his book, African Americans in the Furniture City, talks about how Grand Rapids, like other small towns and cities, smaller cities in the Great Lakes region, avoided ghettoization of the community. And then because, too, of certain religious and the political traditions of these areas and the smaller town, they were more egalitarian than some of the larger cities. And African Americans strove to live as respectable middle-class citizens. So they weren't restricted as to where they lived. This is a map of certain areas where more than one family collected. On the west side of the river, you'll see up in the upper left, the area right where Grand Valley downtown campus is right now, that was streets like Mount Vernon, Jackson. One of my families lives on Jackson. When the Historical Society remembers the talk about Daniel Gross's barbershop in the 40s, later in the 40s and 50s, that was in that neighborhood. And Mel Goolsbee, many of you remember Mel Goolsbee, that old genealogist and historian. I wish he was still alive because I have so many questions for him yet. And he grew up in that neighborhood, so he talks about growing up there. A second pocket was north of Wealthy and west of Division. Spring Street, or what's now Commerce, Girdwood, Finney, Williams had African Americans living in that neighborhood, and the Arnett Chapel was also in that neighborhood. AME Chapel was in that neighborhood. That congregation, that AME congregation, when they built the new church, they moved a little bit east and built it in that section just south of Wealthy, off to the right of the far right circle on your picture here. This is Charles Henry James Sherman, that area where First Community AME is on one corner. Very old church. Messiah Missionary Baptist is on the second corner right next door. And then across the street is a Johnny-come-lately St. Philip's Episcopal Church, which wasn't organized till 1911. You can still see expanded versions of all those buildings there on those corners today. And many people live in that little neighborhood there. Another area is down on Division, down south. I was on 5th Avenue, according to this map, which is Franklin Street. St. Luke's AME Zion Church has always been in that neighborhood. And James Phillips is a name that comes up because he was one of the founders. He was that 1850 family, one of the families. Their family were the founding members of St. Luke. So the population in the 19th and early 20th century, it pretty much lived in different, they didn't all live in these particular sections. They were scattered around. And a lot of them lived in the county, I should say that quickly, in the townships, because many of them who immigrated in the 1800s were farmers. So they naturally were south of Grand Rapids, north of Grand Rapids, and even in the northern counties. But as far as the city goes, they weren't restricted in that sense yet. And they pretty much formed, though, and they attended public schools around the city and the township schools, but they pretty much formed their own cultural institutions. I mentioned the churches. They also had their own baseball team. They had their own fraternal organizations, the Colored Masons, the Colored Elks. They had their own political clubs, the Colored Republican Club, the Douglas Republican Club, and they had social and literary societies like the Lincoln Literary Club or the Phyllis Wheatley, and the still well known today because it still exists, is the Grand Rapids Study Club, for which we have, like I mentioned, their collection upstairs. They weren't formed, though, until 1904, but they're still around and still meet regularly. And while many of these people may have been leaders in their churches and their political clubs and grand masters of the fraternal organizations and so on, their jobs did not reflect any of these leadership skills or their level of education. If you didn't own your own business, like some did, some of my examples will, the best jobs were waiters and porters at hotels and clubs or at Union Station or the railroad car. Or they might have been a private valet in a private family, and later, as cars came along, chauffeurs for private families. Others were called bootblacks, iron workers, foundry-type jobs. And I think the logging community appears to have been open to African-American labor as well. There's a great story about one of those logging camps, but I don't have time. But I'd love to tell you sometime. This is one of the porters that lived in Grand Rapids. This is Joseph Ford. I have Emma Ford's name up there. You'll see her in a minute. Joseph C. Ford. This is a younger picture on the left and an older picture by a train by Union Station when he was a porter there. As a young man, he worked for the railroads, and there was one reference that he was a bodyguard to the president of one of the railroads. But he was dubbed Senator, nicknamed Senator, because he worked in the state capitol building in Lansing in the cloakroom for many years. 1893, the Herald refers to him as the Lord High Mogul of the Senate cloakroom. And another article just a few days later says Senator Joseph Ford, they call him Senator, of Grand Rapids, presides with his old-time affability over the Senate cloakroom. Joe is thoroughly at home in his accustomed haunt, and his features have become permanently fixed in a broad, pearly grin. Here we can have a collective eye roll. That was his forepay work. But while working in Lansing, he got to know everybody there, and he attended state and national Republican conventions. In 1890, he was a delegate to the state Republican convention. 1896, he's connected with the Douglas Republican Club in an article about them. And he was president of the NAACP once it was formed in 1919 here, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the First Community AME Church. The next picture is of him and Emma in their older years. This is their 50th anniversary picture that was printed in the Herald in 1931. And Emma here was also a force in the community. She was could be described as a club woman. There were several literary clubs around that were the black women's answer to the Ladies Literary Society Club and all the other clubs around the city. They had formed the 19th Century Club, which used to be called the Married Ladies 19th Century Club, and the 19th Century Married Ladies Club. She was president of that for a time. There was also the Bible League, the Phyllis Wheatley Club, the Pulpit Aid Club. Ford was president of that, too. The women formed their own colored union in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and Emma was president of that as well, and she helped to organize it. The two annual reports that are like a 60-page book in the archives after each of these annual county-wide Union of Unions meeting of the Christian Temperance Union, Emma Ford in one year reported in 1898 to the formation of what they called the Sermon Union, and it hadn't really got off the ground yet. She didn't have much to report. The next year, a newspaper was reporting on this mass meeting, the annual mass meeting, and they said, the principal paper on Wednesday afternoon will be delivered by Mrs. Emma Ford on the WCTU work of the colored people. The 5 women's clubs joined together to host the annual State Federation Women's Club Conference, which was held in Grand Rapids here in 1907. Lucy Thurman, a nationally known clubwoman from Detroit, came to speak and stayed at the home of Emma Ford. In 1898, one of the press reported on one of the meetings of the 19th Century Club. When the women there rose up, they weren't sitting around drinking tea. They rose up in arms over an editorial that disparaged the African American population, to which Mary Roberts Tate eventually wrote a response. But at that meeting, Emma Ford came up and gave the group all kinds of numbers and percentages and statistics they could use to disprove this editorial that had been printed. They did print Mary Roberts Tate letter in the paper in response also. Just a few other small items that round out her character. She was the chair of this combined church Easter celebration musical thing, and another time it said that she summered up in Mackinac Island while they weren't vacationing. When African Americans summered up in Mackinac Island, they were working up there. But she came home and opened a catering business. This was reported in the paper, saying having, quote, acquired skills catering over the summer to fastidious wants of summer tourists. I don't know how long this catering business stayed in business, but completely started it. James Craig is that collection I mentioned upstairs, and so we don't have to rely on little bits of pieces gathered here and there, although they do help to round out his figures. It was in 1885 that the Detroit Times was doing a feature on, quote, the most prominent colored men of Michigan, unquote. And so they contacted James Craig, and he sent them this brief biography, which is in his collection, handwritten in pencil on a couple pieces of paper. And you can read it upstairs. It's in his biography file, so you don't even have to get it out of the archive. But he talks about being born a slave until 1849, until 1962. So then you think about it, okay, here's this 13, 14-year-old kid, and the Civil War comes along, and he hitches up to the 23rd Regiment, Michigan Regiment, and he travels with them. He follows them around, which you hear stories like that where a slave will hook up with one of the Union regiments and kind of follow them around. Anyway, he ends up with these Michigan connections. He ends up in Flint, staying in the home of the captain, I assume, of that regiment. He took care of that captain as he was ill, and then he learned the barber trade, moved to Battle Creek, didn't succeed there, but he moved to Grand Rapids in 1871. Opened his barbershop on Canal Street, and he said in his biography at the end, and I am pleased to say it has met with success. Indeed it has. And this is an ad. He places a quarter-page ad in the city directories for his barber parlor, where he has 5 artists that work, and he talks about all the things, including dyeing beards. I like that, whisker dyeing, in case your beard turns gray. There's also a scrapbook in there where he has pasted all these different articles, some very lengthy and some very small, like this one about his barbershop in 1885. This one talks about baths are available, hot and cold baths. And then 6 chairs to serve. So he definitely was a success. He was also respected by the barber community. He was elected as an officer of the Union of Barber Proprietors in 1886. Craig is not in any one of the Grand Rapids histories, though. I don't find his name, even though he organized and founded the North Star Colored Masons Lodge right after he arrived at Grand Rapids. And he was the Grand Master often when the Colored Masons moved and got together once a year in different parts of the state. And his wife, Mary Buckner, founded the Martha chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star, the women's auxiliary to the Masons. He was interested in politics through political clubs, and he talked about running for city commission and maybe a representative in the state legislature. That was in 1898, and that same year, the governor of Michigan appointed him and a few other Michigan men as delegates to, and I don't know anything about this conference, but a Congress of white and colored Americans at Omaha. All before the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. James Craig had 3 daughters. Myrtle Craig, who married James Lasha. Grace Craig Sims, Grace, who married Clarence Sims, a name that still Joe Ellen mentioned, Ellen Sims, or maybe it was Julia Ellen Sims this morning, a name that's still floating around today. And Lena Craig Christop, she married George Mortimer Christop. That wedding was described in great detail in the Plain Dealer down in Detroit. And Myrtle, I think you see her name comes up. You see these names, especially once you know the married name. You see Myrtle's name comes up. She's often, when they have a little entertainment before a club meeting, they have a pianist or a vocalist or somebody give a reading of a poem, and Myrtle is often giving a piano solo. I think she was a pretty accomplished pianist. So once you learn all these names, and I was looking through the William Glenn collection, and I turned over this photo, and there is Myrtle Lasha, and I was so excited. I just grabbed a picture of James Craig's daughter. I thought first it was William Glenn's mother, but it wasn't. It was in his collection, and I don't know why. He must have known her also. So we are left with that lovely picture. The next person is another entrepreneur who had his own business. Is John J. Johnson. Those of you who have a name like Johnson or Smith or Jones, you realize it's not good for tracing people down. It's easier because there are just so many Black Johnsons in Grand Rapids, so that helps if you're in the census records anyway. But he does make it into Baxter's History of Grand Rapids. He's listed as one of the present, that would have been in 1891 when the book was published, one of the present officers of the AME Church. Indeed, the article I found on him in the paper and his wife, that first picture was taken from the same article, and this was an article in 1907. This is Clara Vincent, who I never heard of, and this is Mrs. Johnson. So I not only have a picture of John Jay, but I also have a picture of his wife, Mary. We do find that he said in his obituary, it said that he was born in Michigan. He lived his whole life in Check County. His parents were also born in Michigan. So he was already second generation of freedmen living here in Michigan. In 1900 census, it said, though, his wife was born in Canada, and her parents were born in Kentucky. So that tells maybe a little bit of story about her family. And then they also list her immigration date back to the United States, or into the United States for her, in 1875. They marry in 1885, and I don't think they had any children, but their house was open to a niece at one point. And later, an elderly woman who could no longer care for herself. She was a former slave. The newspapers loved to write these stories up about former slaves, and they wrote one up about her who was living with the Johnsons. And they lived over by that section of the map by Division and Franklin Street, and hence the AME Church there that they were working with. But 1896 is going through the city directories of his employment. He's superintendent of the Grand Rapids Heavy Moving Company. His business was active, according to his obituary article, in other cities like Lansing and Kalamazoo, moving large structures. like that house Don Bryant mentioned this morning, or even bigger. So when he died in 1915, he was 66. Oh, I didn't mention the ad in the 1907 city directory. Forgot that. When he died in 1915 at age 66, the Herald said, quote, "He is recognized as one of the wealthiest Negroes in the country." I love this headline because it's 1904. And if people think civil rights started after World War II in the 50s and 60s, no, it started a long, long time ago, and they were already fighting. This one is as early here as 1904. This was an article in the Grand Rapids Saturday Post. This group of men, they were talking about that were going to visit establishment owners in the Ramona Reeves Lake Entertainment District about admittance into their clubs and theaters. And they were going to form a league to fight these sorts of indignities. And they're quoting the whole time from this guy named William Gaines. And I thought, well, who is William Gaines? And you find just a little bit, there was a little bit, an article about his death, but you don't really find too much else about him, except that he was also born in Canada, and his parents were born in Kentucky and Indiana. But he came to Grand Rapids in 1890, but he just kind of disappears from history. But his wife's name is Louise. And Louise Gaines, especially in the study club collection, her name is up there in those study club annual yearbook reports and so on as either an officer or she's delivering papers and talks on books and whatever else they did, whatever else they talked about in those meetings. So she was very active there, and her name, I run into her name more often than I did Williams. This picture I included only because it was one of his daughters. They had two daughters. And Alpha was a teacher in Covert, and she was fairly young, and she got sick and died rather young, so it made the news here in Grand Rapids. Most of you have heard of Hattie Beverly. There's tutoring centers named after her, and there's Grand Rapids Community College has a scholarship named for her. And she was known because she was the first African-American school teacher in Grand Rapids Public Schools. She was the daughter of John Beverly, pictured here, who was married to Minnie, who was a Dutch woman born in the Netherlands. And they didn't have just Hattie, though. They had four daughters, Mabel, Ethel, and Minnie, along with Hattie. And we discovered Ethel, the Women's History Council, discovered Ethel when they were, discovered Ethel when they got the, when they were researching the farmers markets, Jason Otto, the farmers markets movement, and the good food push during World War I. And this was an article from an article in the paper, this picture that I have of her, an article of the paper about her. She was a community chairman for food preservation, volunteering for the war effort with the colored women, training them how to can food mostly and how to procure it. Indeed, her 1918 Civil Defense, National Defense Committee card registration form that she filled out, along with 23,000 other Grand Rapids women, she says she already devotes 2 afternoons to this work, but she's willing to work 1 more afternoon to something else, for something else. Well, it turns out Mrs. Theodore Burgess here is Ethel Burgess, who is Ethel Beverly Burgess from the same family as Hattie. So I've picked up a few tidbits besides that article about her. I went a little bit out of order here. This is the article, and look at this. They list the names of all the women that are working with her. So there's another nice list of African American names that you can start to go through. But I find out a few little things about her. She, in 1894, she's just a young teen here. She's singing a solo at the Oddfellows, the Union Fair. And in 1899 and 1900, she attended the kindergarten training school. She's listed as a returning student in 1900. And in 1901, she's listed as a graduate of the kindergarten training. This is the new kindergarten movement in the late 1800s of Froebel out of Germany. And it was quite popular here among the women in Grand Rapids. We have not yet found out that she actually taught kindergarten, because, well, the kindergarten was usually a private sort of thing then. It wasn't part of the public education system yet. But there's she has a very famous son named John, who I'll describe in a minute. In all his biographies online and all around, he mentions he was son of a waiter and a kindergarten teacher. So she might have taught for a few years there. 1904, she marries Theodore Burgess in early June, and there's a big reception held for her by Lillian Bell. There's the Bell family. And Mrs. Daisy Lacy. They live on James Street. Mrs. Daisy Lacy. Daisy Lazy, that was bad. They live at the house on James Street, and they honor Ethel Beverly and her groom-to-be the next day. The press also mentions Theodore and another guy named David, two colored waiters at the Pentland who found time yesterday to take unto themselves life partners. So that's how they announced their marriage. But more importantly, Ethel was important in the development of the St. Philip's Church, Episcopal Church I mentioned a few minutes ago. She was one of the early canvassers when they went to the Episcopal bishop and said that there were like 4 African-American families, so we'd like to start a church. And he said, well, how many people you got? And he said, why don't you take a canvass? And so one of the first people they asked was Mrs. Theodore Burgess. This is recorded in their 50th anniversary booklet. That they asked her right away, Mrs. Theodore Burgess, who remained an enthusiastic supporter. Indeed, in 1922, 10, 11 years after the church was organized, they wanted to raise their church above the ground. They had been meeting in the basement. And there was a committee formed with representatives from all the Episcopal churches in this diocese around the city, and 3 members from St. Philip, George Smith, Robert Bowman, and Mrs. Theodore Burgess. But like I mentioned, her claim to fame at St. Philip's anyway, it was her son John, who became a bishop, he was a pastor, first of all, going back to his church he grew up in, and then he rose to bishop in the Episcopal Church, and he had the largest diocese over in Boston. So when I called the church, they said, oh yeah, I know Burgess's, John, oh yeah. I said, well, I was really asking about John's mother, and no, she didn't know anything about John's mother. I was hoping for a picture somewhere buried away in some closet, but that was not successful. So I'm hoping, another resource I didn't have listed is following the obituary trail. Like John's children are probably still alive, and I know they're still alive. He died just 5 years ago. So if they have any pictures of their grandmother, and maybe I could find one that way. My last snapshot, I'm doing all right, is Daniel Lampkins. I love this guy. We know quite a bit about him. He's a little later than all the other people I've been talking about. He walked into Frank Sparks, a newspaper editor's office one day, and said he was going to run for city commission. Well, Sparks took a liking to him and a very interest to him. He must have talked to him for a long time because he wrote a long article about him. And then about a year later or 2, he wrote another long article about him. So we know quite a bit about his biography and so on because Frank Sparks kept writing about him. But briefly, he was born in Kentucky. He grew up in Indiana, went through the 8th grade for school. And at a certain point, he walks up to Eartham College, which is a Quaker college in Richmond, Indiana. And he wanted to attend, but without the right requirements, they said no. And he asked, well, can I take the entrance exam? So, okay, they humored him and gave him the English part, which he scored with the highest applicants of any that had also taken that. So they didn't even bother to give him the second half of the test and say, yes, you may well attend, but it's $25 a term. And he said, well, I'll take $2.75 worth because that's all he has. So again, I think this man endeared himself to the president of this college and who found work for him on campus and found room and board, working for room and board and professors' houses and so on. Even while he was at Eartham College, he began his public speaking career. He came to Grand Rapids in 1907. He was married to Lulu Goons, and they bought a little house on Charles Street, and they had 3 children. And while he wanted to work in newspaper publishing, he told Sparks, he started a monthly titled The Pilgrim. But having to feed his family, he found work as a porter in a barber shop or sometimes a bath attendant at the depot. This was a picture in that first article about him. Then the U.S. enters World War I, and he decides he needs to do something. So through the YMCA, he's appointed secretary and sent to France, providing services to the soldiers. For instance, he would hold their money for them. He'd lend them money. It said cashing checks. He would plan activities, relaxation activities, and he even cared for the six soldiers on the boat over. General Pershing was nearby and noticed him, and after the armistice, he asked him to go with him to England. He introduced him, though, on the way to Premier Clemenceau in France, and Lord George was not available, so was introduced to King George in England. In addition, he had discussions around London with scholars and leaders, and he wines and dines. His writings were being printed in New York, Boston, London, Paris, Glasgow, Edinburgh papers. He returned to America. Before he comes back to Michigan, he does a little circuit throughout New England and New York, and with public speaking, and he meets with former President Theodore Roosevelt. So Spark finishes this second article. This one, a whole page spread there on him. He finishes his second article saying, so Daniel Lampkins is back home again, back from France and ready for further service. But that service will not be as porter in a barbershop. He's grown too big for that. You'd think. But in the city directories, he's not that much bigger. The jobs he gets after that is shipping clerk. He's a station attendant at Universal Motors, a garage, and he worked for 20 years. He did keep running for office, though. He ran for legislature a few times. 1951, he runs for the Charter Commission, and his credentials were listed as a Republican always. He was a clerk in the State House of Representatives. That might have been before 1907, and a YMCA secretary. And he was a member of the NAACP and the Grand Rapids Businessmen's Club. This last picture is in 1965, and he says the same battle is being fought in 1965 as I fought in the early 1900s, the battle for equal jobs. My last picture, are you standing there ready to roll me in? You've got a cane. This is one of my favorite pictures because it's the NAACP, so these are a lot of leaders in this picture's dated 1920 in the archive. And some of them we kind of figured out who they are. If you know who they are, that would be wonderful. You can tell the people upstairs. There's two women. I was hoping one was Viola Ford, but Mel Goolsbee said no. So I'm hoping Mel was wrong once, that one of those women is Viola Ford, is Joseph and Emma's daughter, by the way. But a 1919 article about the NAACP lists these men. Thomas Benjamin was president. James Edward Jones, there's another good story. I got to tell you about him sometime. John W. Wilson, Basil Ray, Theodore Burgess, Lucas Benjamin, Viola Ford, George Smith, and Fred Bellis. So again, names that we know that were leaders at that time period that don't know.
Was I right?
Thank you.
Remembering the time we went to we have about 45 seconds.
Any questions?
Do you have a question? This is a great opportunity. You don't have a question.
I'd
like to hear one of those stories.
James Edward Jones.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This little gizmo here. Yeah. Kind of.
Can you set it so it Well, Gina's going to test it out for me. I am. The mic up there.
Okay, we're about to get underway now.
Good afternoon. It's fine. I'm going to let Andrea move it. My name is Gina Bivens, and I am the current president of the Grand Rapids Historical Society. Welcome to our 11th History Detectives Day. I love this day. It is such a great event and so many collaborations going on with so many history lovers groups, I guess I would say. I am very honored and privileged. I work at the Public Museum at Grand Rapids, and I am very honored to introduce our next speaker. Andrea Melvin is the collections curator at the Grand Rapids Public Museum. She has been digging around in the museum's closet since 2009. She has expertise in historic clothing with over 10 years of experience working with museums' collections. She's currently managing the museum's efforts to catalog and photograph its historic clothing collection. She's doing this through a grant awarded by the Institute of Museum and Library Science, IMLS, and she's using a material culture approach to her research by analyzing historic fashion objects to uncover their hidden stories. Andrea Melvin.
Thank you for joining me. Okay, is that good sound? Okay, I've got a little voice. I've got a Canadian accent, though, and I can't help that, so. All right. So thank you so much for coming here today for this fantastic program, and thank you so much for the History Detectives Committee. You guys do a great job. It's a wonderful day. And I just, as Gina mentioned, I'm the collections curator at the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and I've been there for about 8 years. And I really love our clothing collection. It's been a huge focus for me, so this is a real honor to present about it today. Today, we'll be specifically peering into the collections of the Voigt family's clothing. The Voigt family, I'll give you a little bit of history about them, but their collection of personal dress, which dates from the late 19th century until the 1970s, is housed in our permanent collections at the Public Museum. What's so exciting about these garments is that there is just so many of them. The size and scope of a collection that relates to one family in a museum, it's pretty rare to see this many garments from one family. And what's also really neat about this collection is that they're not pieces that the family collected or curated. It was a collection that was saved, and it survived the test of time. The Voigt family is also, their collection is particularly unique because of the 1,100 pieces alongside. Now, you will actually notice from the program, I think I originally quoted that there was about 600 pieces. That was when we were only partway through our inventory. So I underestimated how many pieces there were, so our staff have a little more work to do on that collection, but it's a pretty immense collection in size. And they also, the family had meticulous record-keeping skills. They collected diaries, their letters, their financials, photographs, and their residence still stands in Heritage Hill. All of these things give great context to this collection. And we also have in the room today some garment highlights that you can feel free to check out at the end of the program today. I'll keep them up until after our last presenter as well, so if you want to come and check them out. Also on the table is a stack of photographs that I found of previous volunteers who used to do fashion shows with the Voigt clothing. And so we have some of those pieces that were actually worn by people. That's no longer best practices for museums. We don't usually wear the clothing because, a couple of reasons. They're so fragile that wearing them right now would be really hard on the garments. Also, perspiration and other things can actually help or can actually damage the clothing. And the other kind of issue is, it seems like people were smaller back then, but I don't know. I mean, there was no McDonald's, so we find that a lot of the clothing is smaller. Though there's a lot of reasons for that, it's not really that people were that much smaller, actually. In fact, they were both the same size. But we end up having a lot more clothing, actually, of younger women that survived. So that's sort of why we have so many small garments in the collection. And so you're going to see some highlights as well from our current efforts to photograph the collection. And these photos are all now available online. So you can see in this next slide here that, let me see. There we go. You can see in this slide is actually our online database. So all of the Voigts clothing and accessories are now available virtually. You can browse through and check those out. The website is up there as well, grpmcollections.org. And that's available through the museum's main page if you forget that URL. And through the support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services and also generous community sponsorship, this research project and also our larger stewardship project of the clothing collection is all thanks to them. We are preserving and cataloging in total 5,600 items. Though, as we know from my counting skills, that it's probably more than that. It's probably closer to about 6,500 by the time we're done. And we have a couple project staff that we've hired who I'm very grateful for. Kelsey Lehman, and actually I'm going to have you stand up, and Monica Taylor. I think they have the best job in town because they get to go through the collection and photograph all the pieces, dress them on mannequins, and catalog and research all of these pieces. They're about halfway through, so presently we have about 2,500 pieces that are now available online from the entire collection. And this is great for the overall preservation of the collection. We don't have to handle things as much as we used to because we can basically just, browse through the collection online. I also want to thank Kendall College of Art and Design. Their chair of their fashion department has provided us with incredible interns from the fashion profession who are helping out with this project, and fashion historian Sally Helvinston Gray, who has been a great research support for me, and Sally's over at MSU. And I can't help but thank the dedicated volunteers from the Voigt House. For over the years, there was many volunteers there that worked to actually inventory the clothing and do some preliminary cataloging work. And I just want to tell you that you did a great job. So if anybody's in the audience that worked on that, I am very grateful. The surviving family wardrobe was stored in their residence at 115 College Avenue Southeast. And that house was built in 1895 for retirement. It was the last home that several of the family members would reside in. And the home and its contents are now owned by the public museum. At this time, there's no public access to the Voigt House, and how it will be accessed in the future is being reviewed by the museum. There's also some restoration work that needs to be done on the house, so the museum will be looking at that as well in the near future. But today I'll be focusing on the clothing. It was an important preservation priority for the museum because of how incredibly vulnerable the clothing was. You can see here in this first slide of the staff moving the collection out of the Voigt attic where it was at great risk of damage. There were insects in the attic. There was natural light coming in from a window, and the garments were stored. I mean, you know what attics are like. They're the fluctuation of the humidity and the hot and cold temperature in the attic was pretty extreme. So we were really glad to get those objects out of the attic. And now you can see, I really like an organized closet, so we've got all of the clothing lined up it's now stored in the Community Archives and Research Center. The Community Archives and Research Center is the same building. You might know the City Archives and the Kent County Archives, just over around the corner from the old museum building. So it's all stored in there. We've got a great facility, and a room full of clothing. So it's pretty incredible. So you'll see that the Voigt clothing has all been moved over there after it had gone through a freezing process first. So we froze all the clothing, make sure we killed off any little insects. And in this fantastic picture, I just absolutely love this picture. It's of the Voigt, Herpelsheimer and Company store. I'm going to look at that in a second. But first off, I just want to share a little bit about why this topic is so important. My hope with sharing the Voigt clothing is to demonstrate the valuable and often overlooked potential of clothing as a rich resource for historians. As I take you through the highlights from the collection, there are a couple of points I'd like to make. And first off, I hope to share how clothing was very important to the lives of the growing middle class in Grand Rapids and the elite classes in Grand Rapids in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Voigt collection provides a window into the fashion, culture, and society of Grand Rapids while weaving together personal stories of the family. And the second point I'd like to make is that the clothing in this collection actually gives a voice to working class women as well, who were dressmakers and milliners in Grand Rapids, and they also contributed to the Grand Rapids community. And often those women did not make it into the history books. So investigating these garments actually can offer valuable clues about their lives as well. In case you haven't heard of the Voigt family, there's a bit of background history as well to them. The father of the house, Charles Voigt, and his business partner, William Herpelsheimer, maybe some of you shopped at Herpelsheimer's department store, you might remember that name. They ran a dry goods store known as Voigt, Herpelsheimer and Company in Michigan City, Indiana. And in 1870s, they actually opened another store in Grand Rapids. By 1875, they moved their businesses and families completely to Grand Rapids, recognizing the potential of the city as a strategic location. It was a furniture capital, manufacturing hub in the Midwest, and there was a lot of access for them to get goods to Grand Rapids for selling in the store. Their store was located on 42 Canal Street, which is now Monroe Avenue, and it was incredibly successful. As we know, Herpelsheimer's was around for a very long time in Grand Rapids. So you see here this incredible picture. This is from the Grand Rapids Public Museum collection. And, the Voigt, you can see even just in this picture just how influential they likely were when it came to fashion. They, this picture from about 1890. At that time, they were listed as selling dress goods, fabrics, notions, ribbons, and undergarments. Also, Budrick paper patterns for sewing, and carpet and upholstery. And you can see this example as well of, this is an actual pattern book from the Voigt, Herpelsheimer's & Co. It was stamped for the store, for sale in the store. And it shows fashions from about January 1900. And you can also see that it was something that was available. They were sharing Paris trends, London fashion trends, and New York. So they were bringing fashion from all over the world right to Grand Rapids. The family had first settled on the west side on Court Street, later Scribner Avenue. And for about 20 years, they lived in that home. That's before the last home that they lived in, which I mentioned is on College Avenue. And they had their last two children there, Carl and his wife. They're the parents. They had 9 children in total, and 3 had died young. 6 lived through adulthood, and the 6 that lived through adulthood are the ones that I will be talking about today. You can see in this picture, this family tree, we've got Charles and Elizabeth at the top, and you can see on the bottom from left to right is Frank first. Frank was the oldest, and he was married and lived on College Avenue near the family home. He was prominent in the milling business, which they also had a milling business, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. Clara was the traveler of the family, and she was married to a prominent Grand Rapids physician, William Hake. She later moved back to the family home when her husband passed away, and so we have many examples of her clothing. We anticipate a large amount of the women's clothing is actually from the daughter Emma, who was unmarried and resided in the College Avenue home throughout her life. She often traveled with her sister. And the daughter Amanda, who you see with the child, she was married to a gentleman named Charles Perkins and only lived in the home for a little bit. She was married there, but we don't have any garments that we've been able to identify as hers. Carl graduated from Central High School. He was active in the mill business as well as the Grand Rapids business community with his younger brother, Ralph. And you see Ralph there as well. Ralph was a graduate of Yale and the last living family member in the house. He was a bachelor and lived in the home throughout his life. I think Ralph really liked clothes, so I'm really happy about Ralph because we've got lots of Ralph clothes. So yeah, you'll be hearing a little bit about the family as we kind of go through and share some of their highlights. But I did want to mention the mill. The Voigt Herpelsheimer's business, it prospered alongside the growing city here in Grand Rapids. But by 1880, they opened 2 flour mills. The 2 families did. By 1902, they actually dissolved their partnership. The families did. So the Voigts kept the mills, and the Herpelsheimer's family kept the store. So that's about 1902 that happened. The flour mill business continued until about 1955. And I just absolutely love this picture. This is from the Grand Rapids Public Museum's collection. And you can see here that it is a view of the mill from the Pearl Street Bridge looking towards the west. And it's actually the same property as where the Grand Rapids Public Museum is on the river. And if you notice too, on the left side you can see an old water wheel. This is a very rare photo of a water wheel on the river. And next time you're at the Public Museum, take a look at the foundation of the building. You'll see some of the stonework as well that's still on the building from the mills. The Voigts were tasteful, they were practical in their fashion, and they had great style. And they donned clothing that was, pretty typical from the period that demonstrates their wealth, financial stability. Even when we know from their financial records, which we have a lot of their financial records, that there was financial strain on the business sometimes. So even during that time, they still maintained their appearance. Their collection shows fashion suitable for many different social occasions, and what makes me really excited is clothing that you don't typically get donated to museums. People like to donate wedding dresses, special occasion pieces, baptismal gowns, things that they hold on to, and this collection has things that usually don't get offered to us. Other things such as athletic wear. We have some pieces of athletic wear in this collection, as well as garments worn privately in the home and undergarments as well. During their lives, they experienced incredible changes in fashion from their formal styles that they wore in the 1880s and 1890s to the more relaxed fashions of the 20th century. And we'll be seeing some examples of that. So in this first highlight, this was Elizabeth Voigt's clothing piece. This is a dress that she wore around 1903. We've dated it. This is the first one of 2 garments, actually, that we have really identified as being Elizabeth's. When researching clothing, I normally step back and look at the overall fashionable shape and silhouette of the piece to kind of hone in on the date that it was possibly made and worn. And then we do more of a deep dive into looking at the fabric and the sewing and, to give clues about its history and how it was made and also how it was worn. For this collection, I also got to examine the family's collection of photographs. We have a lot of historic photographs from the Voigts, and so that's a fairly unique thing to get to do when you've got a clothing collection, is actually to examine, pictures of them actually wearing the pieces. So this is one of two dresses, and discovering those photos was really exciting for us with this piece. You can see here, there's a photo of her wearing it. This photo was taken actually in the Voigt house, and it was hard to tell because the wallpaper's not up yet. So we could tell from the carpet, though, that it was probably worn. So right around the time the house was built, probably just as they had moved in. And, what the photo actually did for me was helped confirm some suspicions with this piece that there had been some restyling to it. So there had been some modifications or alterations to the dress, what we today would call upcycling. So you can see in the picture, the sleeves are actually slimmer to her arms. And then you can see also the front part of the bodice, the white section, is also a little bit different. So what is really neat about this discovery is that we kind of can link back to, the idea of why would this be changed, when would it have been changed, and so, this dress has actually been dated now to about 1903. That was when I believe maybe around the time it was last modified. It's a beautiful silk that has been built into these sleeves of the dress now. It's a very quality silk. And you can see, doing some archival research, we found pictures of something called the bishop sleeve. This is in the 1903 issue of The Delineator. It was a women's fashion magazine. It's possible to see the sleeve trend. So, she took a dress that was probably worn in the 1890s, early 1890s, and modified it to have the sleeve be a little more fashionable. And so the Voigts were no strangers to fashion, and so they probably would have seen something like this journal. But also in their own collection, they had other shirts. We call these shirt waists or bodices, and this was worn in This was actually made in Grand Rapids by a label called Teal, and also features that bishop sleeve that was what was being modified. Across the board, actually, through this whole project, we've scattered through the collections, the greater collections of the public museum's clothing, there are other examples of this upcycling. This dress you see here is kind of one of more of the extreme examples. It originally dated to about the 1860s, based on the blue checked silk fabric. That is the foundation fabric. And also the center front buttons was very stylish. So those have appeared to be covered. There's also some seams and that we think may have been more of an 1860s styling. And originally, we think this dress probably was worn with a crinoline, so it would have been much bigger, more of a hoop skirt style. The skirt was taken in. Buttons were covered in black fabric, but the most prominent alteration is the lace overlay that was applied to bring it up to date with, we think, more of the 1890s. Creatively making back pleats, which you can maybe see in this picture as well in the back of the dress. But really the big giveaway was that this dress, they took the lace and they just covered over pockets. They just, really to make these stylish, they would go to great lengths. And this dress was donated by Mrs. Zeno Nelson in 1962. It was a dress that, as I said, is not part of the Voigt collection, but it's part of our larger collection at the museum. Updating dresses was very common across all social circles as a way to repurpose clothing and reuse valuable fabric, even among wealthy women like Elizabeth Voigt. Domestic sewing was an important part of the female sphere. We know from the Voigt women they owned a Singer sewing machine. They had a sewing room, garments and fabric were just such valuable commodities. There was no Forever 21. You couldn't just go out and buy anything or replace the next fashion. Women were taught to sew at a very young age, and creatively recycling fabric. It was a testament to it was a virtue from the Victorian period to be frugal and to reuse. This gown here is just incredible. This is one of my favorites in the collection. It is a satin and lace evening gown from about the early 1890s. This gown was worn by Clara Voigt, who I mentioned married a prominent physician in Grand Rapids. She was not wearing her wedding ring at this point, and as you can see from this photo that we found of her in the dress. So we think it was taken before her 1893 wedding. This gown is beautifully made by a skilled seamstress, as indicated by the quality sewing and artistic detail, the draped lace over the shoulder, and the run of 16 pearl buttons down the front. Each has a neatly hand-sewn buttonhole. It's fashionable in its pastel pink color, the satin and the lace overlay. It also had a multi-paneled skirt, which is called a gourd skirt. That was very fashionable. It gave it a little flare at the hem. And the photo of her wearing it was actually taken in Grand Rapids as well by a photographer called Sharpstein of Grand Rapids. Another clue that helps us in our clothing research is finding makers' labels in the garment. During this period, labels are rarely found in dresses, and Parisian fashion couture designer Charles Worth, he is associated with actually having makers' labels put in dresses. This was something you could do to brand your dress or your clothing items. Many garments in the museum's collection are actually unlabeled from around this time period, so finding a dress that has an original label in it from Grand Rapids is a very special find for us. And you can see here in this picture, this is a detailed shot of the actual label. This dressmaker's label it was located on the interior waistband of the bodice, so of the top part of the dress. It's got some beautiful gold lettering, and it reads Mrs. F. McClelland Robes, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And this important piece of information has helped us to build the biography of this maker, also get a glimpse into what her life was like, and what working in the dressmaking trades were like here in Grand Rapids during this period. The fact that Clara chose to actually wear that garment made by a local dressmaker for her formal studio portrait is actually important to note as well. It's an indication that locally made clothing was of a high enough quality and it was considered fashionable enough that you would want to wear it during a special occasion. And the Midwest was able to compete with other fashion centers around the world. This black bodice was also made by Miss F. McClelland and was worn by Clara Voigt. So during the same process, as we went through the collection, we were able to find other dresses that had this maker label on it. This is a beautifully beaded bodice, which I have here today as well if you'd like to look at it. And I've got it open so you can actually see the label. So, we've been able to find actually in total three garments from this maker. This is not from the Voigt collection, but it's from our larger dress collection. It was a beautiful dress by Miss F. McClelland, and was gifted by Marion Alsover. So Grand Rapids has an incredible historian who some of you might be familiar with. Albert Baxter. He's written a book in 1891 it's called The History of Grand Rapids. And he stated that, basically what he does is he goes through and he records all the industries that were around at that time and kind of goes in and highlights some of those industries and who's the who's who of the industries. And what he says is that the art of dressmaking the ladies of this city is well supplied. He doesn't really say too much about them, but we can see from this chart, which I've put together, it's from using the city directories. So I've gone through the different years and kind of highlighted the dressmakers, the number of them that were available at that time. And these statistics are similar to other major cities in the United States, showing a period of female work in the dressmaking field, and many of them were entrepreneurs as well. Just before the ready-made industry took off, often led by men. So the years 1890 to about 1915, back down around 1921 is when you start to see the decline of the dressmakers, and then move to more of a ready-made sort of industry. But in his book, Baxter, as I mentioned, he typically dives into kind of the who's who of the various trades that he mentions, but he glosses over this line of work. He states further that in this trade, it is useless to attempt particularization of names. It's enough to say that they are fully equal in taste, skill, and expertness by those in comparison to other communities. So he's saying that the dressmakers are equal to in quality to other dressmakers. However, I think Mrs. McClelland wanted us to know her name. Otherwise, she wouldn't have labeled all of her dresses. The simple label connected us to a lot of information. I could probably do a whole presentation on this one woman. But the simple label connected us to a lot of information about her. She was born in 1849 in England to an English mother and an Irish father. She arrived as an immigrant from Ireland in 1874 and was living with two other women who also immigrated in the same year. We don't know why they chose Grand Rapids, but I'm guessing it had a lot to do with it being, a lot of signs of economic growth here, and there was definitely going to be a good place for her to set up her shop. One of the women she came to Grand Rapids with was listed as a housekeeper at the home, and another was listed as a dressmaker and likely worked for her. Frances was listed also as a modiste, meaning that she identified herself as a fashionable dressmaker or a milliner. So far, I haven't found a photo of her, but that will be something that I'd really like to get my hands on eventually. Her business was first listed in the Grand Rapids City Directory in 1876 when she was about 25 years old. She continued in the trade for about 41 years. Until her death in 1919. In her first years in Grand Rapids, she was listed as living at the same address that she worked. Then over the years, she changed addresses. Her business was set up on streets like Monroe, Ionia, Jefferson, and eventually she no longer lived at the same address that she worked. She was listed as a head of a household in the 1900 census, and lived with a boarder and two domestics. So these are really good indications that she established herself. Frances' elite clientele, excellent sewing skills, her pride, having beautifully labeled her garments, point to an ambitious, business-minded woman. Women working in this trade, the majority of them, like Frances, were unmarried, which we can see from the city directories. Work was a central part of their lives, and these garments help to connect us to those women's stories. The Voigts' interest in American-made clothing, especially clothing from retailers in the Midwest, was made clear in their travel letters written home from a 7-month travel trip to Europe. They did a grand tour of Europe and wrote home lots of letters. Every couple of days, they wrote home a letter. This trip was taken by Emma and Clara, the sisters, and Clara's husband, Dr. Hake. And this letter that I'm going to share, she actually had talked about how she was not going to buy a gown in Europe while she was there. She was going to wait until New York. So they reported actually minimal shopping when they were in Europe. It wasn't, for a very wealthy family, I was a little surprised by not the amount of clothing that they purchased. They also seem to, just overall from their collection, they seem to prefer American-made clothing, especially from Midwest retailers. A lot of their clothing comes from places like Marshall Fields in Chicago. They would do trips to Marshall Fields and buy clothing, but then some local stores as well. Fashion that came up quite regularly is in their letters was this beautiful shirtwaist garment. This lightweight, typically white cotton or linen blouse could be worn all year round. There were 9 of these in the collection. So it was the garment that showed up the most in their collection, and these were very common amongst women from the turn of the century. It was available at varying price points, so a lot of women could buy these and afford them at different qualities and different styles. And when they're advertising them, the ads in different catalogs seem to promote how they were a great convenience for women to wear. They were comfortable, they weren't corseted, they didn't have the boning in them, yet women would still wear corsets with them. This was one of my favorite finds, really, was when I went through the letters. They complained a lot about laundering them, which I hadn't thought about before. But I guess, if you're more active, which is what these garments allowed for, you would have to launder them more. One of the women, Emma, when she was writing home, she said, "This morning, put on a cotton shirtwaist, and now money will fly away paying the laundry bills." She was complaining about the laundry bills, which is kind of funny because I don't think they actually did their own laundry. So their active lifestyle with wearing these waists are seen in many of the photographs, and here are a couple of my favorites. This incredible photo is showing Amanda and her new husband, Charles Perkins, on a honeymoon trip. They are at Lookout Mountain in Tennessee. She is wearing some incredible clothing, Victorian attire. She's got a waist, a necktie, and a basic dark skirt that was perfect for the Victorian traveler. And this picture here is a lovely beach picture of the family. I haven't identified the beach yet if anybody has any thoughts. But this is probably about 1905, and they are wearing some of those shirt waists, as well as some nice long white skirts to go with them. So this next highlight, as I mentioned, what really struck me about this collection was the appearance of clothing that just doesn't appear in museum collections. Poor Carl, because I'm actually showing his underwear in my presentation. This is a union suit. It was made by, as you can see up here with the Great Label picture, by the Globe Knitting Works. And so that was made right here in Grand Rapids. The union suit was a relatively new style for underwear for men. It started out as an undergarment for women in the 19th century called the emancipation suit, and was eventually made for men as well, especially for working men, because they could be, sort of serving as like a warm wool layer under their clothing. The original men's design was full length, and it buttoned up in the front, and it had a rear flap, which was traditionally made of a red flannel. And the museums in the collection as well, we do have an example of something of a similar style. And we've dated it to somewhere between 1920 and 1950, though I think it's probably closer on the end of 1950. So this is something that is actually not in, this particular piece is not in the Voigt collection. This is in the General Museum's collection. You can see the front of it, and then also this is a back view of it. It's kind of funny when you read about the union suit. Definitely jump on their Wikipedia. It's got a great history. They had some great names for the back flap of the union suit, some funny nicknames. The access hatch. The drop seat, fireman's flap, and one, I feel really bad saying it, cover your kids' ears for this one, crab flap. So throughout the early 20th century, American companies, they continued to make improvements in design to the union suit. It became a standard necessity for men's wardrobes. The Globe Knitting Works, established here in 1897, produced underwear by using a circular knitting machine that had been introduced to the United States from Europe around the 1870s. And then the fabric was cut and sewn using a pattern that would snugly fit the body. In a Grand Rapids Press article, the company recalled the men's early underwear was 2 pieces and cut like a flour sack. The Globe's designs were tailored to actually fit, and that is what they advertised, was that they were actually comfortable, they were going to fit the human form. And the museum actually has one of their knitting machines, which you can see here on the screen. This was actually donated by the Globe Knitting Works, and what's really cool about it, too, is it actually has some of the fabric, the knit fabric, still left in it. The Globe Knitting Works, that you can see the picture here from 1926, all the machines lined up, all the workers. This company was located on Ionia Street, just south of Union Station Railroad Yard. It was one of their buildings is now an apartment complex, which is just down by the downtown market. It says the Globe on the front of it, so you check that out. The Globe was a major employer in Grand Rapids. They had about 1,300 people at their peak employment. Like many American knitting companies, though, they hired mostly women to run the machines. And the company grew, especially during World War I and World War II. They were given some contracts for military underwear. And Voigt Herpelsheimer's was the first to actually buy their items. The Voigt family, they were shareholders. So when I went through their records, I noticed that the Voigts actually were shareholders throughout the history of this company. So again, the Voigts are at the center of modern local fashion. So through the study of the Voigt collection, there's a great connection with the people who not only wore the garments, but also the people who made the garments. The period which the Voigts lived, there was incredible changes in fashion. You saw from the earlier pieces, there was some handmade, hand-sewn garments, as well as ones made by dressmakers. There were garments as well, though, as you get to the Globe, that were more made with mechanized methods. So the museum's collection, it's an incredible resource, as you can see from my examples. I hope that you'll jump online and check it out. There's just so many great pieces, and, search names and see who wore the pieces as well. Take these pieces and see what do you have in your closet that was worn by your family members, or that's sitting in the old trunks in the attic, and see what those stories will tell. There are, I wasn't able to scratch the surface of this collection with my presentation, but I did want to, I think I've got probably a minute left. I'm going to flick through some other really great highlights from the collection. Here is a cute little outfit. This is a little outfit worn by Ralph from about 1890. You see a photo of him wearing this, and that is over here as well today, so you can take a look at that. This was a mariachi costume worn by Ralph as well. As I mentioned, Ralph was the last living descendant of the generation of the Voigts that I'm looking at today. We have lots of his clothing. So this is something that he probably wore while he was at Yale University. He played the banjo, and so I'm guessing he wore this as part of one of his costumes. A necktie worn by Ralph. What I love, about these photos that we found is that you can see in as you're going through the black and white photos, they do absolutely no justice to the color that was available in these garments. And also you get to see him have a little fun. He's got this great polka dot tie that looks like a lime green color, and they've got lots of ties that they held on to as well. This beautiful dress, and also this incredible fur coat worn by Emma. It's still in fantastic condition. The last one here is an athletic vest, probably worn by Ralph, but we don't really know for sure. This was made by Spalding Brothers. Spalding, you've probably heard of them before. They make lots of baseball and other sports equipment. And an evening dress worn in the 1920s by Clara. And this dress has some incredible Egyptian iconography on the front of it, which was very popular during the 20s. Another pretty dress. So I just want to share my resources for this project because there are some incredible fashion historians that I have sourced throughout this presentation. You can see as well a link to our website, grpmcollections.org, if you want to browse the collection. We're doing this for you, so please take a look at it. I'd just like to list those books, The Dress Detective, How to Read a Dress, and another great book about another family in Michigan, American Style and Spirit, Fashions and Lives of the Rodas Family. So thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody, if we could find our seats for our final presentation of the afternoon. All right, my name's Colleen Markey. You may remember me from earlier this morning when I kicked this shindig off. Well, now I am very honored and pleased to introduce Michael J. Page. We began this event with family history and local history coming together, and we're going to finish this event with family history and local history coming together. Michael J. Page was born and raised in Grand Rapids. He is a fourth-generation Rapidian, in fact. Mike worked at St. John's Home, Garfield Park Neighborhood Association, and retired from the city of Grand Rapids after serving as a house inspector, police dispatcher, 911 operator, and for 10 years was the staff support to the Historic Preservation Commission. Mike and his wife are very proud to be host families for the West Michigan Whitecaps and enjoy the players that live with them during the baseball season, usually young men from Venezuela, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. I also happen to know that Mike regularly sings the national anthem at their baseball games. Today he will be discussing the North End in the Creston neighborhood and how it got its name. And with that, without further ado, I give you Michael J. Page and the North End Gets a Name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Everything's on, right? Okay. Thank you very much. Before I begin, I want to assure you of a couple of things. The clothing that I have on is from my closet. It was made for me several years ago, about 12 years ago, from a local seamstress who made this for me, 1860s era clothing, and just for another event. But I just want to make sure that you understand that I did not take it from the collections of the Grand Rapids Public Museum. So they keep a close eye on that collection. The other thing I want to assure you is that I'm aware of an 1860s era fashion etiquette, breach of that fashion etiquette going on right now. Maybe some of you know, just by looking at me, what that breach is. I'm told that, you're exactly right, I'm told a gentleman would never wear a hat inside. So for this presentation, I will doff my hat, and I won't, yes, I will. Thank you, Brian. You can't keep that. You can't keep it. Also, when in public, a gentleman would always wear a coat. When he's in public, he would wear a dress coat, and he would not expose his sleeves, except maybe when he's at home or with friends. Then that would be acceptable. But however, I do not own a overcoat of that nature, so hopefully you will indulge me and understand that I'm going to do this presentation without a dress coat on, if that's okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, well, let's get into it. We got a lot of things to discuss here. Topics to be covered is the 1850s to 1906 era in the North End. And I'll tell you what the North End, or at least what I'm talking about the North End, in just a minute here. Here it is. This slide shows the North End that I'm talking about, and we're talking Leonard Street on the south, College on the right, on the east, Knapp Street up here on the north, and the Grand River on the west. So that's what I'm calling the North End. And we are, just for a frame of reference, we are right about here, sitting in the library. And so the North End is about 2 miles, 2.25 as a north of where we are as a crow flies. Okay? And then, let's see, what else did I have on? Okay. The other thing that I wanted to cover is that we're also going to be talking about North End influences, the things that influenced the development of the North End as I just defined it. The railroad, the street railways, the churches, the schools, the businesses, the fire department, and if I have time, a couple of movers and shakers that helped influence the development of the North End. And then I'll be ending with how the name Cruston came to be. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning here. 1850, the city charter was adopted, and we're no longer just a village. We're an official city, and we've got an official seal. We've got an official motto, Motu Vigit, which translates to strength and activity. Maybe everybody here knows that. I'm particularly glad to see our city clerk is in the audience today, and I believe we're still using this seal today. And Darlene O'Neill, thank you very much for being here. However, I wanted to tell you that when I was researching for this project, and a lot of researchers have the same thing, we're always looking for something, written records, maps, photos, those kinds of things that help us tell our story, depending on whatever the topic it is. And I did come across what I think is, and maybe Darlene knows this, not too many people know this, but I think I came across the first, it looks like to me like the forerunner of the actual city seal that we have here. So collectively, I know we have a lot of historians here. Well, you're all historians in your own way, right? So this next one, I'd like to have you keep an open mind and see if you think that this was maybe the prototype or the forerunner of today's city seal. And what do you think? That's it's even got a smile here, right? Just I thought I'd throw that one in there just so that even historians have a sense of humor at times. Okay, back to 1850s. The north line of the city was established as Leonard Street, and just for a frame of reference, in 1857 it was bumped all the way to Sweet Street, and then in 1891 it went to all the way to Knapp Street. This being Plainfield Avenue here, and the river. Okay, and it's all within the 5th Ward at that point. The ward numbers changed whenever they wanted to change the numbers, apparently. So I'll talk to the city clerk about that. Okay, I want to mention Louis Campbell. Louis Campbell was obviously the founder of Grand Rapids. And this is his wife, also Sophie. He arrived in 1826, is considered the founding father and the first person to establish a permanent residence here. The first white man, I should say, to establish permanent residence here. So I'm going to reference him in just a few minutes. So I wanted to let people who don't already know or have an image in their mind about who Louis Campbell is. I wanted to show you him. And this guy is Lauren M. Page. He arrived here in 1836. He is my great-great-grandfather. This was, yes, he had 5 sons that served in the Civil War. And he was a paper hanger. He was a glazer, guy that puts glass in homes and things like that. He painted houses. He was pretty much a common labor type of guy. One thing he did do, he kept some journals, and this is the first page of the journal, and it's not, you're not seeing things. This is the actual photo, and it's not the ink is bled through obviously, and it's hard to read, but we have scanned this journal, and the journal is dated, by the way, from 1847 to 1851. So it's an old document, and This is us scanning this, myself and my daughter scanning the journal. Just to tell you a little bit about this journal and how it got to Grand Rapids, it hasn't always been here. I learned of this journal several years ago from my cousin Sue Page Malinowski, and she said it was in the hands of her sister, Mary Beth, who lived in the Windsor, Canada area. And she said that her sister was very protective of the journal because Lauren writes of burying money in one of his properties. So, however, Mary Beth, to her credit, agreed to share the journal, and it journeyed from her home in Windsor, Canada, to Detroit, Michigan. John Page had it in Detroit, and he sent it to his brother out in Sacramento, California. And his name was Gary Page, and Gary sent it back to me because we both agreed it belongs back home here, and we also agreed that it should be donated to the Grand Rapids Public Library, and this is where it belongs. And so we've done that, and it's here in the special collections, and they're taking very good care of it, and all we have to do now is get it transcribed. And we've done a little bit of that, and the staff here has done some of that. But we certainly have more to do. That's another shot of the journal. That's me and my daughter Maria. And Maria has helped quite a bit. She happens to have experience in working with fragile and sensitive documents at the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and so with her help, we've got this the journal scanned. But to date, it has not given up any buried treasure, location of any buried treasures. I do want to mention here, and I'll read this, and you don't have to read it if you don't want to, but this is from the History of the City of Grand Rapids by Albert Baxter. One plain piece of work done by Mr. Page is perhaps worth mentioning here. When about 1851, Lewis Campbell built a lookout or observatory on his house on Fulton Street Hill and was about finishing it, he said, "I'm pretty rich. I shall paper this room with money. Here is the money." He brought forth a stack of bills of the People's Bank, and with these, Mr. Page papered the room. And then he goes on to say, and it's not on the screen here, but he goes on to say that they were still on the walls when, a few years since, the house was removed to make room for a more pretentious modern dwelling. La-di-da. Huh? Okay, this is a favorite photo of mine. This shows the intersection of Plainfield. Plainfield comes up from going north here, goes between these two structures here, and it goes up this way and on the left side of this structure. Leonard Street would be coming down right down here, going from east to west, and crosses here towards the river. And the railroad this is 1865, era 1865. And so the railroad was here, and it goes through here. And of course, you're familiar with the North End. We still have those streets, and that railroad is still going through. But what maybe you didn't know is that this structure was the Occidental House, and then they called it Parnell House. But it was a hotel. Okay, so we had a hotel here right by the depot, the train depot. And on the other side over here, that is another hotel. And then up here, this large structure here, you guessed it, another hotel. This is the Baldwin House, the Parnell, the Baldwin House, and this was called the Sherman House. as you can see, in 1865 era, we already have some development going on. I call this the lower North End, but there's already a lot of development, and probably due, well, and I'm sure because of this, the railroad that came through at that point. And we talk about that in just a minute. Yes. I think I covered everything there. The Iron Horse or the railroad came in to Grand Rapids in 1858, and it was called the Detroit Grand Haven Milwaukee Railroad, and it was the only rails that were here for 11 years. So if you wanted to come into Grand Rapids by way of rail, you came in and you got off at must be operator error here. You got off and on right here. If you're leaving or coming into Grand Rapids in those 11 years, that's where you came in and out of. So that was a very important spot for the development not only of the North End but of Grand Rapids. Again, the Iron Horse, it came in 1865, and a great celebration took place in the city. A local newspaper reported the jail was full that night. So some people celebrated a little bit more than others, apparently, but and of course, in 1861 to 1865, this is where all the local boys, not only from Grand Rapids but from all of West Michigan, they would have left from the depot there at Leonard and Plainfield. And if they were very, very fortunate, they returned to the same place. So with the railroad came jobs in the form of factories, especially furniture factories, mills, lumber mills, grain mills, residential development, commercial development, schools, churches, recreational opportunities, and parks. So that railroad was key to the development of the North End. Okay, public schools. You got to have some schools, right? Well, we had schools coming in. Coldbrook School was. They had a couple different locations for Coldbrook, but one of them was right at that Leonard and Plainfield location. That one kind of morphed into, if you will, East Leonard School. In 1860, East Leonard was the first brick school in Grand Rapids, and went ahead too far. Then there's in 1884 there's Plainfield Avenue School, and then also in 1893 Palmer School. Some of the early schools, East Leonard, some of you might be familiar with. It looks like that now. Plainfield Avenue School was quite a structure, and that was on Plainfield Avenue, wouldn't you know, and it was on the east side of the street, just north of Quimby. If you're familiar with that area, this is a graphic map of 1888. Plainfield Avenue School was right here. This is Plainfield Avenue. This is Quimby. Lafayette would be right up in here. And as you see, Lafayette stopped at Quimby and didn't go through until 1930, I believe, is when this structure came down, and they were able to put Lafayette through to curved around and down to Plainfield Avenue. Okay. Now, this I was asked to include this structure, so it's not just because it was named the Page Block, which was located at the corner, or at the intersection, I should say, of Plainfield was right here, Quaid Avenue is right here. This is these tracks are not are made by a horse-drawn cart or something, horse-drawn. It was not a rail line at that point. This building was built in 1880 by the Page family. One of the Lauren Page's sons, one of the veterans of the Civil War, he built this along with, and he had a drugstore here along with his son. And the Page residence was on the second floor. And on the third floor, they called it Page Hall. Page Hall was a meeting spot for fraternal organizations, you name it. It wasn't a bar, but it was a hall, and they could access that from this side entrance down here. Okay. The other thing that Julie wanted me to mention was that there's some information out there, that misinformation, I should say, is that eventually these two stories came down, and we now have a bank building there. But that is not correct. This is, again, this is not the best photo, but Plainfield Avenue, Voigt. It's changed a little bit. But we now have this structure there. That is a brand new structure. It was in 1920. So if anyone tells you that the old building, the top two floors came down and we still have that bottom floor, that's not correct. Okay. But that's the same location, same footprint of the Page block, as they call it. Okay, churches in North End. We've got to have churches, right? Especially in Grand Rapids. Second Congregational Church, that was built in 1869 was the Second Congregational Church, and this church was originally, it was at the corner, or it was on Monroe, Canal Street when it was built, just north of Leonard Street, in close proximity to the Grand River. And in fact, it was in such close proximity to the Grand River that it was given it quickly got the nickname the Bullfrog Church. And apparently, especially in the summertime, the pastors were trying to do their thing, and they had competition from quite a few bullfrogs living in there. And actually, eventually, the bullfrogs won because about 1876, about 6-7 years later, a Reverend Olney said he wanted a drier location. So this church was put on log rollers and pulled by horses up to the corner of Plainfield and Grove. You know where that is. Probably about a good half mile, maybe 3/4 of a mile, but it was all uphill. I'm guessing they may have gone to Leonard Street and came up Plainfield, but I don't know that for sure. And I suspect, too, that maybe at that point it was just this portion of the building, and that maybe this was added later. And then that building was replaced by this one in 1900. This is the one that I remember as a child, and it's quite a structure. I never went inside because a good Catholic boy would never go into a Protestant church. And then this building was removed in about the 1960s to make way for Children's Bible Hour building, Children's Bible Hour, and that building, that corner now looks like that. This is Plainfield Avenue, and this is Grove. So in the 50s and 60s, there seemed to be a lot of flat roof, one-story buildings going up. I'm not sure why that is, but the North End was not spared by that construction. Downtown got the same kind of construction, only they had multi-story boxes, if you will, instead of one-story or one or two-story that we have. Okay. Okay, Plainfield Avenue Methodist Church. We got to have some Methodists, right? Was at the corner of Plainfield and Madison. Was at the? I said that right. It was at the corner of Plainfield and Madison Street. Madison Street was later changed to Spencer. Okay. But you had you wondering for a second there, didn't I? Pretty common church structure, pitch roof, bell tower, and you can see the bell in there, hopefully, there. Didn't have the louvers protecting it or anything, but it was open bell. And that structure was, the bell was dated 1884, and it's still operable. And I know that because in 1910, it was this structure was replaced at the old church, the original church. And I had an opportunity to get up on the roof of this church, and I took that opportunity, and I had my camera with me, and there is the bell. And it's still operable. There's a hole in the roof basically that goes down to the church area, sanctuary, and it's still operable. And I know it's 1884 because Bell says it is. It's Henry McShane and Company, Baltimore, Maryland, 1884. That was pretty cool getting up there. And okay, St. Alphonsus Church, I can't leave that out. St. Alphonsus was first built in 1889 as a temporary church, and it was both a school and a church, built in 1889, and the school was on the first floor, the church was on the second floor. I didn't know that when I was going to this school. The school had been, or the top floor by then had been converted into a cafeteria area, kind of an auditorium. I didn't know that until I started doing more research on the history of the church. But it was a temporary situation, temporary for 20 years, until St. Alphonsus was built in 1909. This was a rendering of the original church, what it was supposed to look like, and of course it looks like that today. However, if you want to donate probably $1 million or so, they might put the spires back on and maybe put your name on it or something about that size. But that's St. Alphonsus Church as we look at it today. Engine House number 5. Well, we've had a fire department serving the North End for 143 years. The first location was in 1875 that I could find at Taylor Avenue and Leonard Street. And in 1880, that's the Taylor Avenue and Leonard Street. They just kind of moved in. That was not built for that as a fire department, but they kind of just moved into that structure. And then in 1880, this structure was built, state of the art at that point. If you can see to the left there, there is a covered bridge that goes over Leonard Street. I'm sorry. This was at Leonard, Monroe, I should say, Monroe down here. Leonard runs just the other side of it. Okay, and that is the Leonard Street Bridge that was replaced the one prior to it, but this one was a covered bridge. So a lot of things like this helping to develop the North End. That another slide there that guys showing off the latest and greatest equipment. Of course, at that point, it's still obviously horse-drawn. But in 1980, 100 years later, this building was slated for demolition. I'll try to make this really quick, and I won't do justice to the whole story, but it was slated for demolition, and the city said it's got to go. It's outlived its usefulness. And a guy named Jeff Dupilka came to the rescue, and he said, "I'll buy this property." And the city worked out a deal with the city that he bought it for $1. City said, "You got to move this thing in 10 weeks," and which I thought, would be impossible. However, he and a bunch of his friends, a crew, dismantled the old one, and rebuilt it out in Allendale, Michigan, and that's what it looks like today. It's just an amazing feat. All the architecture is the same. I mean, you have to go there to appreciate it. Even if you don't go inside, just go walk around it. It is a Engine House No. 5 museum to this day. And if you go onto their website, you're going to see how that demolition, or not demolition, but disassembled process went, and how they reassembled it, and that just blows my mind how that turned out. But of course, we still have engine number 5 in service over at same location at Monroe and Leonard, but it looks like that now. So it's didn't quite look like the other one, did it? Okay, streetcars in Grand Rapids. Oh boy, did we have streetcars. We had streetcars in Grand Rapids starting in 1865 with a horse-drawn, and it went to 1935 when the last electric car went out of service. And if my math is correct, we have teachers here, that's 70 years, right? Right? 70 years we had streetcars of one kind or another going through the whole city of Grand Rapids. And we did have them in the north end. The first horse-drawn cars went up Plainfield Avenue from Leonard. They went up Plainfield, and then they took that cut off right there down Coit Street, and they ended at Sweet. After several years, that line came up, and then they extended it to up Plainfield to Sweet. And then further, after the electrics came in, it was extended all the way to Knapp Street, where they took a left onto Knapp Street and went around the corner and through a vacant lot, and then came back down. And if anybody knows the north end, that corner there at Knapp and Plainfield, that vacant lot is still there to this day. Am I doing something wrong? Is that lunch, maybe? I don't know. There was another line right down Taylor Street from Leonard, right down Taylor Street, all the way to Sweet. And I believe, and I'm not sure, but I believe that was a cable-driven or cable car. I got to double check that. Somebody here might know, and you can tell me later. And then after that, it went. This was then called the North Park Line. It went by steam locomotive driven, and it went all the way out to the North Park area, past the Michigan Veterans Facility, and into the North Park area. And I've got a few. There's a typical horse-drawn. City of Grand Rapids right there. And this is a steam-driven sample of a steam-driven of the smaller locomotives. That's what the steam-driven locomotives look like. This one was actually a cable car that was converted to electric, so they did do some recycling back then. And this actually was a horse-drawn car that they converted to electric. So, but back to this map, I want to tell you that this other line right here went off of Plainfield. It went up Carrier Street, past St. Alphonsus, up to college, took a left, and then went all the way up to the Kent Country Club, which had just started in 1901. And one of the executives' wife, the story is one of the executive wives, she wanted to entertain her friends at the Kent Country Club. So she said, I'd like to have a line put in. So that's what they did. That's the story. And okay. Oh, that's the vacant lot at that I was just talking about at Plainfield and Knapp, where the streetcars came up Plainfield coming from the south going north. They would go around the corner and they would go in. Well, this wasn't there then, but that's a newer curb cut. But they would go in and then exit right back out onto Plainfield. And this next graphic is in 1901, a total of 11 million people rode the streetcars in Grand Rapids. When I saw that, I thought that can't be. 11 million people in 1 year. Of course, it's not just the North End, but throughout the city of Grand Rapids. It tells you what kind of an extensive streetcar system we had by 1901. By then, it was pretty much all electric. And I wanted to point out to you, did I go blank on me? There we go. This book by Carl Badgema and Tom Moss, which I got a lot of my information from. If you are if you like old photos of Grand Rapids, if you like old photos of downtown, streetcars, if you're into the history of the city of Grand Rapids, you may want to consider either looking at this book up in the special collections section of this library, or purchase a copy of this if you want to complete your. And I don't get any money from that sale, but I thought I would give them that plug. It's a wonderful book. The maps in there are just amazing. The graphics and the photos. Oh. Okay, where are we? I think I'm going to have time to talk a little bit about one of the movers and shakers, Charles C. Comstock. This guy had his fingers in all kinds of things. He started was president and started the Grand Rapids Chair Company, and which was located right on Canal, or Monroe as we call it now, just past Sweet, right by the railroad tracks here that go across the railroad, or across the river. So he was right in here and the building is still there to this day. Some of you may have know it as Baker Furniture. It was Baker Furniture for several years. At its height of they were turning out 450 styles of chairs and employing anywhere from 250 to 400 men. So this is a major player in the North End and throughout Grand Rapids. He did pretty well because he built a house up on Boltwood, northeast, and this is one of his. This is his house, and it's a Grand Rapids historic landmark to this day. What are we doing on time? Are we getting close? I'm sorry? Okay. Well, then I'll take a lot of time on talking about a new name for the North End. By 1906, the merchants and residents they disliked being called North Enders and Fifth Warders, and there was another term called the Bloody Fifth Ward. If anybody here happens to know why or how that term came about, I want to talk to you after this presentation, because in 1906, I found a newspaper article that at that time nobody knew how that came about. There's some theories. We've got some theories on how that came about. But just that name alone kind of stunted the growth of the North End. I want to live in the bloody Fifth Ward. Or I want to live in that bloody Fifth Ward. It could have been used as a mild swear word, right? But they wanted to, the area that I'm talking about, they wanted to get away from that North Enders or Fifth Warders or the bloody Fifth Ward. They wanted their own identification, and so they devised the contest to name the shopping area and, of course, the residential area, surrounding residential area. And the prize was $10 in gold, which at that point was probably a lot of money. 5 minutes, thank you. And so there was a meeting. It was before the meeting. This was throughout all the newspapers and garnered a lot of attention, especially the $10 in gold. And they had, like I said, dozens of names were proposed, and they had a meeting in Shanahan Hall, which is still there today. The downstairs, I think, was Shanahan Hall. The up two stores, these were residential units. And today, is it the Reservoir Lounge or something like that? Apparently, you've been there. Okay. So we have it on good information that it's the Reservoir Lounge. Okay. At any rate, the top 10 names were Norwood, Cruston, North Grand Rapids, Fairmount, Glenwood, Gravelin, Englewood, Woodlawn, Highlands, and Northfield. There was no Pagetown or Pageville, which I thought it would be a good, there'd be a shoe in, but I guess that didn't make the cut. And the 300 people who showed up at this meeting overwhelmingly voted for one name, and of course that was Cruston. And Cruston combines the words crest and town. And the winner was Albert Morgan, who lived on Dale Street, a local guy, right? And the new name was quickly embraced by merchants and residents. By the way, the meeting was also the start of the Cruston Citizens Association. But the very next day, there were newspaper advertisements advertising the businesses, announcing businesses. The Cruston branch of the State Bank of Michigan, the Cruston Shoe Store, the Cruston Grocery. I mean, this thing took off quickly, and you could just tell that just by looking at the ads and how quickly things progressed, that the people in that area and the merchants especially wanted something, wanted their own identification. This is an article or an ad from the next day, the Cruston branch of the State Bank of Michigan. And of course, it was in that Page building by then, the Page block. That looks familiar. Cruston Grocer, Cruston Shoe Store. Okay. And what else do I have here? I've got, there's an article that Cruston revels in its new name. You don't have to read all of that, but it's all about the meeting and how happy everybody was to get a new name for that area. And this one has nothing to do with Cruston. It was in the same newspaper, but I kind of like the ad, so took a little bit of and I thought Andrea Melvin, is she still here? Yeah, you'd like this one, right? Beautiful, isn't it? Thank you very much. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have time for Do we have time for any questions or no? We do have some time for questions. If you have any questions, if you don't, that means I've covered it. We do have. Oh, we have a question. I'm sorry. Yes, I saw that myself. The footprint of the house, but I don't know. Oh, she was asking about. She saw a map, an old Sanborn fire insurance map from about 1888, I believe it was, and she saw what looked to be an octagon house, or the footprint of an octagon house on Taylor Street, just north of Leonard on the east side of the street. And I think that's the question. And do I know anything about that? I've seen that same footprint, and I have not gone into that any further. So that's a good one. I'll put that on my list for the Quimby's. I don't know exactly where the Quimby house. I could, I had houses that I was going to talk about during this presentation, but I had to eliminate a lot of things, and so the houses, Cruston area is just full of old houses. I ran into one built in 1860 on Carrier Street, just off of Plainfield, and that's an old house. That's pre-Civil War, but they're all over the Cruston area. Anybody else? Yes. I'm sorry? No, I'm not Professor Page. Well, yeah, we didn't get the Cruston name. We didn't get it named Pageville or Pagetown, but we did settle for Page Street. And Page Street first appeared in 1872. Runs off of Plainfield, just north of Plainfield, or off of Plainfield, just north of Leonard. And it was named after the Page family, after Abel Page, actually, who was a cousin to the Lauren Page. So, yeah, we've been there for a while. We've been there for 71 years, and my brother still lives at that house. So, the family has been in the area, in the Cruston area, for 167 years. So, we've got some deep roots. Yes. Well, I know that on any old house, the first thing to go would be would be the porches, weather-wise. So I don't know. They're normally in the older houses, they were built of wood, and then if they're going to be replaced, they would often replace them with brick. But lots of red brick streets, yes. You're exactly right. There was a question over here. Yes. Cruston High School was after the period that I was just talking about. I believe it was constructed about in the 1920s, and I'm guessing about 22, 23, 24, somewhere in there. Maybe somebody here knows for sure. My father was in the third graduating class, and that was 1932. So I think maybe it was 27 or somewhere in there. But I don't know right off the top of my head when Cruston High School was. But it was in the 1920s, I'm quite sure. Yeah. Okay. I think that's it. Thank you again. Thank you very much.